Sophie Martinez was 7 years old and loved to collect the glowing flowers that grew near the edge of her colony. The flowers only came alive at sunset, turning bright blue and purple colors that made the whole forest look like it was alive with magic. Her mother always said the flowers were dangerous, but Sophie knew better. She had been gathering them for 2 years now, and nothing bad had ever happened to her. Today was like any other day at the Kepler 442b colony. The sun was dropping low in the sky, and the air felt warm and thick. Sophie wore her blue jumpsuit with the colony seal on the chest, and her dark hair was tied back in a braid. She walked with 4 other children from her school class, all searching for the prettiest flowers they could find. Their teacher, Ms. Linda Wallace, watched them from a distance, sitting on a rock near the forest boundary. The Silentvox forest stretched out before them like a wall of green and gold. Trees grew so tall that they looked like they touched the sky. The ground was covered with strange plants that moved when the wind blew, making soft, whispering sounds. Sophie's father said the plants were alive in ways that humans did not fully understand yet. He was a botanist, which meant he studied plants and how they worked. He spent most of his time with the green things of the world, and he had taught Sophie to respect them and never waste them. Sophie found a cluster of flowers growing near an old fallen tree. She knelt down carefully and started picking them, holding them close to her chest so they would not break. The other children were further away now, searching in different directions. Ms. Wallace was still on the rock, looking at something on her handheld device. That was when Sophie heard the sound. It was not a sound that any human made. It was not the noise of the wind or the forest creatures that lived peacefully in the trees. This sound was low and deep, like something heavy was moving through the woods. Sophie froze. The back of her neck felt cold, even though the air was warm. She stood up and looked toward the forest. The flowers dropped from her hands. At first, she saw only shadows between the trees. Then the shadows moved, and they became something real. They became creatures that Sophie's mind could not quite make sense of at first. Her brain tried to match them to things she knew but failed. These were not like anything in the colony's animal database. They were tall. The first one came out of the trees fully, and Sophie realized it was almost 8 feet high. Its body was shaped like a wolf or a dog, but wrong. The legs were too long and too thin. The head was massive, with a mouth full of teeth that caught the light and shone like crystals. The skin was not skin at all. It was hard and clear, like glass, but it moved with the creature as if it were alive. Inside the clear skin, Sophie could see things moving. Organs, muscles, blood that glowed faintly red. Sophie wanted to run. Her legs wanted to run, but she could not move. Then she heard Ms. Wallace scream. The creature howled, and the sound was worse than the appearance. It was a noise that hurt to hear, a noise that said this thing was a hunter, and Sophie was the thing being hunted. More creatures came out of the forest. There were 5 of them, then 7. They all looked the same, with their crystal skin and their hungry eyes. One of the other children, a boy named Ryan, started to run. The creatures turned toward him, and that movement was so fast that it looked like they teleported. Ryan made it 3 steps before one of the creatures knocked him down. Ms. Wallace was running toward the colony now, screaming for help. Sophie ran too. Her small legs pumped hard, carrying her away from the flowers and away from the creatures. Behind her, she could hear them moving through the forest. They did not run like normal animals. They moved in a way that seemed to bend the space around them. They were hunting, and they were good at hunting. Sophie ran toward the colony, toward the safety of the buildings and the soldiers. She could see the fence now, the electric barrier that protected the people. She could see soldiers running toward her, weapons in their hands. She could see her mother standing near the main building, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. Sophie was going to make it. She was going to get away, but one of the creatures cut in front of her. It was bigger than the others, and it moved differently. This one did not try to grab her or hurt her immediately. Instead, it stopped in her path and lowered its head. Its crystal eyes looked right into Sophie's eyes. In that moment, Sophie understood something that her brain had not figured out yet. This creature was not going to kill her. This creature was going to take her. The Alpha, as the pack leader would later be known to humans, reached out one long arm. Its fingers ended in curved claws that could slice through metal. But when it touched Sophie, it was not rough. It was careful. It picked her up like she was made of glass, holding her against its crystal chest. She could feel its heartbeat. It was fast and strong, and very much alive. Sophie tried to scream, but the sound would not come out. The Alpha turned and ran back toward the forest, moving at a speed that made the world blur. The other creatures followed, a pack moving like a single animal. The last thing Sophie saw of her colony was her mother's face, calling her name, reaching out as if she could grab her daughter across the distance. Then the forest closed around them, and the colony disappeared. The Alpha held Sophie carefully as it ran deeper into the silent Vox forest. The creature's body was hard and cold, nothing like her mother's warm arms. But it did not drop her, and it did not hurt her. Sophie hung against the creature's chest, her eyes open, watching the forest move past. She was too scared to cry. The Alpha was taking her to its pack, to its territory deep in the woods. It did not know that it was carrying away the small human daughter of Dr. Marcus Martinez, the colony's chief botanist. It did not know that by taking this one small child, it was about to change the future of two entire species. All the Alpha knew was that this small creature could be useful. This tiny, fragile thing could be used to control the humans, to keep them away from the pack's hunting grounds. It did not know that Sophie's heart was already beating faster, not just from fear, but from something else. Something that would save them both. Marcus Martinez received the news while he was examining a new plant sample in the laboratory. Captain David Foster came through the door with urgency that said something was very wrong. The captain's face was hard and serious, the face of a soldier who had to say something terrible to a parent. Sophie had been taken. Marcus did not remember falling to his knees. He did not remember Foster catching his arm or the sounds coming from his own throat. He only knew that his daughter, his small brave daughter with her love of flowers, was gone. She was in the hands of creatures that nobody understood. She was in the forest. It took him less than an hour to gather a rescue team. He would go himself, and he brought 4 others with him. There was Lieutenant Kevin Hayes, a security officer with 10 years of combat experience. There was Sergeant Lucas Winters, a veteran soldier who had fought on 3 different worlds. There was Dr. Patricia Wells, a medic who had saved lives in the colony's worst emergencies. And there was Dr. Richard Stone, the colony administrator, who understood that losing Sophie would break the colony's spirit. They took weapons they barely knew how to use and food that might run out. They took flashlights and a tracking device that Marcus had activated when Sophie was born. A tiny implant under her skin that would tell him exactly where she was. As long as Sophie was alive, Marcus would be able to find her. The forest was different at night. It was darker and more alive. The plants that had seemed peaceful in the daytime now looked hungry. The shadows moved in ways that made the soldiers nervous. Marcus did not care about the danger. He only cared about the blinking light on the tracking device that showed him Sophie was moving deeper into the woods, away from everything she knew. They found the first evidence of the creatures within the first hour. Blood was splattered across the rocks near where the flowers grew. Ryan, the boy who had tried to run, had not made it far. The creatures had left his body where it fell, as if it was not worth eating. Marcus shut his mind to what that meant. He could not think about what the creatures did. He could only think about moving forward, The forest became harder to travel through as they moved deeper. The rocks became sharper and more dangerous. There were pools of water that glowed in colors that had no names, and Patricia warned the group that the water was likely poisonous. The ground dropped away without warning, and they had to use ropes to climb down into deep valleys where no sunlight had ever reached. The darkness was so complete that their flashlights seemed small and useless. 3 hours into the journey, they heard the first howl. It was distant, but unmistakable. It was the sound of the creatures calling to each other. Kevin put his hand up, and the group stopped. They stood in the darkness, listening. The second howl came from a different direction. The creatures were ahead of them, but they were also off to the sides. Marcus understood what that meant. The creatures were moving in a pattern, a hunting pattern. They were being followed. Lucas wanted to fight. He wanted to set up an ambush and take as many of the creatures as they could. But Kevin knew better. The soldiers had weapons designed to kill humans and earth animals. The creatures had skin that looked like crystal. Nobody knew if bullets would even hurt them. Instead, they moved more carefully. They moved like they were ghosts passing through the forest. They used the rocks and the plants as cover. They moved slowly, and Marcus had to force himself to match their pace. Every second they moved slowly was a second Sophie stayed in the hands of those things. The forest opened up into a wider space as midnight approached. There was a ravine with a stream running through it, water that glowed faintly green. On the other side of the ravine was a cave entrance. The rocks around it were smooth and worn, as if many heavy things had passed that way many times. Marcus's tracking device showed that Sophie was somewhere near that cave. They found a place to hide near the water and made a silent camp. They did not use fire. They did not talk. They sat in the darkness and waited, because moving forward in the dark would mean giving away their position to creatures that could hunt in the dark better than any human could. Patricia tended to their cuts and bruises. Lucas checked his weapons and cleaned them with a cloth, making sure they were ready to fire. Kevin studied the cave entrance through the scope of his rifle, and Marcus looked at the tracking device, watching the blinking light that was his daughter. And he prayed to every god he had ever heard of that she would still be alive when he reached her dot. What Marcus did not know was that Sophie was being held not as a prisoner, but as something more valuable than that. The Alpha had recognized Sophia's small size and her youth as tools. The pack had used this creature. They could use her to control the humans. They could use her to survive. But as the night deepened, something unexpected began to happen in the cave where Sophie sat. The Alpha had torn its side open on sharp rocks while making the run through the forest. The wound was deep and bleeding. Sophie, who had spent her whole life listening to her mother talk about medicine and healing, began to do something that no creature in the forest would have expected. She began to help the Alpha. She used water from the cave pools to clean the wound. She found plants that grew in the cave, plants that her father had taught her about, plants that had healing properties. She worked carefully and slowly, aware that one wrong move could get her killed. But her fear was smaller than her need to help. It was smaller than her understanding that this creature was hurt and alone, just like she was. The Alpha did not move to stop her. The creature simply watched, its crystal eyes following her hands as she worked. And in that moment, something began to change. Something began to crack in the pure logic of predator and prey. The cave system was larger than anything Marcus expected. The tracking device led them through narrow passages where they had to crawl on their bellies, and through open chambers so vast that their flashlights could not find the other side. The walls glowed with the same bioluminescent light that covered the forest. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time. They moved for hours through the darkness. Kevin kept his weapon ready, but there was nothing to shoot at. The creatures seemed to have gone deeper into the cave system, away from the entrance. Marcus understood why. The creatures were intelligent. They knew that humans would follow. They were moving to a place where they could fight without being trapped. The cavern they finally reached was circular and huge. The ceiling rose up at least 40 feet, and the walls were covered with what looked like fur or algae that glowed in waves of blue and green light. The floor was smooth and polished, worn by countless generations of creatures walking across it. And in the center of the cavern, on raised stone platforms, were the creatures themselves. There were 7 of them, maybe 8. It was hard to count because they kept moving. They were arranged in a pattern, with the largest one in the middle. This was the Alpha, the one who had taken Sophie. Its crystal skin was darker than the others, and there was fresh blood on its right side. Beside it, small and fragile, was Sophie. She was alive. Marcus wanted to run forward, but Lucas grabbed his arm and held him back. The creatures had not moved, but they had noticed. The Alpha's crystal eyes fixed on the humans, and its mouth opened slightly. Not in a smile. In warning, Sophie's face was streaked with dirt and tears, but she was not hurt. She was sitting against the Alpha's body, using its hard chest as a backrest. That sight made something twist inside Marcus. His daughter was touching the creature. She was not fighting. She was not trying to run. What Marcus could not see was that Sophie had been working with the Alpha's wound all night. She had found plants that grew deep in the cave, plants that she recognized from her father's teachings. She had crushed them and mixed them with water, and she had applied them to the Alpha's wound. She had done this alone in the darkness, working while the other creatures watched. The Alpha had not understood at first. Pain was something to fight against, not something to accept help for. But Sophie had moved with care, and she had spoken in a quiet voice. She had used words that the creature could not understand, but the creature understood her tone. She was not attacking. She was helping Dot by mourning. The Alpha's wound had stopped bleeding. The pain was less, and the creature was beginning to understand something that no human had ever thought possible. This tiny, fragile creature was not trying to hurt it. This tiny creature was trying to save it. Now, as Marcus and his team stood at the edge of the cavern, Sophie stood up. The movement was slow and careful, as if she was making sure the humans saw that she was safe. The Alpha did not move to stop her. Sophie walked forward, away from the creatures and toward her father. Each step was slow. The other creatures watched but did not attack. The Alpha watched but did nothing. When Marcus could not stand it anymore, he moved forward. Kevin tried to grab him, but Marcus was already running. He ran across the smooth floor of the cavern, and as he ran, nothing attacked him. He reached Sophie and scooped her into his arms, lifting her off the ground. She was real. She was warm. She was alive. That was when the sound came. It was not the creatures. It was a new sound. The sound of weapons being fired. The sound of human weapons. The cavern's entrance exploded with light and noise. Krell hunters had followed them through the forest. The Krell were a species that the humans had been at war with for 5 years. They wanted the Deathworld creatures alive or dead, and they did not care which. The Krell soldiers poured into the cavern, moving with military precision. Their weapons were advanced and deadly, designed to kill anything that lived. They fired at the creatures without hesitation. The creatures howled in pain and anger, and the sound was so loud that rocks began to fall from the ceiling. The Alpha roared, and the sound was different from its hunting howl. This was the sound of a pack being threatened. The other creatures moved forward to meet the Krell, and what followed was not a battle. It was chaos and death and fury beyond anything Marcus had ever seen. Marcus pulled Sophie close and dove behind one of the stone platforms. Kevin and the other soldiers returned fire at the Krell, but their weapons were weak compared to what the Krell carried. They were going to lose. They were all going to die here, crushed between the creatures and the Krell. That was when Sophie did something that changed everything. She looked up at her father and said something very simple, very clear. She said that the forest was alive, that her father had taught her that all living things protect each other, that the plants and the creatures and even the humans were all part of the same pattern, that they all wanted to survive. Marcus did not understand what she meant. He was too busy trying to keep her alive. But Sophie twisted in his arms and looked at the Alpha. She held up her hands and she began to make shapes in the air. She drew pictures with her fingers, pictures made from the glowing plants that hung from the cave ceiling. She made a picture of a family, a mother and a father and a small child. Then she made a picture of the Alpha with the other creatures around it. Then she made a picture of all of them together. The Alpha stopped moving. For just a moment, the creature paused. The other creatures paused. Even the Krell paused, confused by what they were seeing. In that moment of pause, Sophie's pictures began to glow. The plants that grew on the cave walls began to respond to the small girl's movements, to her intention, to her need for peace. The whole cavern lit up with blue and green light. The light became blinding. The Krell soldiers covered their eyes. The creatures stood still. And Marcus held his daughter and understood that she had just done something that no diplomat, no general, no human had ever been able to do. She had shown both species that they shared something more important than their differences. She had shown them that they both protected their young. The light from the plants grew brighter, and shapes formed in the air around them. Images of families and packs and groups of creatures protecting each other. The message was simple and clear and true. Protect the young. That was all that mattered. That was what made a species alive. That was what made a species worth saving. The light that Sophie had awakened in the cave was not magic. It was biology. It was a response that happened when all the bioluminescent plants in the cavern were stimulated at the same time, in the same direction, with the same purpose. The light created a barrier that the Krell weapons could not penetrate. The Krell soldiers fired and fired, but their weapons could not pass through the living wall of light. For the first time, the Krell were afraid. The Alpha moved, but it did not attack the Krell. Instead, it moved toward Marcus and Sophie. The human soldier prepared to die, ready to use his body as a shield for his daughter. But the Alpha simply looked at Marcus with its crystal eyes. And in that look was a message that cut through all the differences between their species. The Alpha pointed at Sophie, then at Marcus, then at the other creatures surrounding them. The message was clear. Protect the young. Marcus understood. He looked at Kevin and Lucas and Patricia, and he nodded. They began to move, creating a position with Sophie and the Alpha and the other creatures all together. The Krell soldiers stood on the other side of the cavern, separated by the wall of glowing light. They were pinned down, their superior weapons useless against a defense they did not understand. Kevin moved quickly. He shouted to the Krell soldiers, telling them to stand down or face execution for attacking a human child. It was a bluff. The Krell did not care about human children, but it gave the creatures time to move. The Alpha and the other creatures shifted position, still protecting Sophie, still moving as a unit with the humans. Lucas had an idea. He said that the cave entrance was narrow. If they could reach it and defend the passages behind them, they could hold off the Krell. They could survive the night and reach the colony by morning. It was not much of a plan, but it was the only plan they had. The Alpha made a sound, a clicking noise that ran through the other creatures like electricity. They understood. They had understood for hours now that this small human child was the reason they would live or die. The light that Sophie had created was still glowing around them, and as long as it glowed, the Krell could not shoot. They moved as a group. The creatures protected the humans. The humans held Sophie between them. Patricia kept her hand on the small girl's shoulder, feeling her trembling but never shaking. Marcus stayed at the front with Kevin, both of them ready to fight if it came to that. Dr. Stone stayed behind, making sure nobody was left behind. The passage back to the cave entrance was long and dark, but they could see the creatures' bioluminescent markings showing them the way. The Alpha moved first, checking each turn and each passage before the others moved through. This creature, this thing that had taken Sophie from the colony, was now protecting her like she was a member of its own pack. The Krell tried to follow, but the passages were narrow. The creatures' bodies blocked the way, and even with their superior weapons, the Krell could not get a clear shot. They fired blindly into the darkness, and some of their shots hit the creatures. One of the smaller creatures went down, blood dripping from its crystal body. But it did not stop. It kept moving, driven by the same instinct that made it protect Sophie in the first place. Protect the young. That was all that mattered now. They reached the cave entrance as dawn was breaking. The forest was beautiful in the morning light, all gold and green and alive with singing birds. Sophie walked out into the light, and she was squinting against the brightness. She had not seen the sun since she was taken, and it felt like she had been away for years instead of hours. The Alpha did not follow them out of the cave. The creature stood at the entrance, with the other creatures behind it, and it looked at Marcus with those crystal eyes. The message in that look was complicated and deep. It said that this alliance would not last forever. It said that humans and creatures would go back to being separate. But it said something else too. It said thank you. Marcus understood. He looked at Sophie, and he made a decision that he would never regret. He held his daughter's hand, and he walked toward the Alpha. The other soldiers raised their weapons, ready to protect him if this was a trap. But it was not a trap. Marcus knelt down so that he was the same height as Sophie. He took her hand and placed it on the Alpha's crystal skin. The creature did not move. It did not pull away. It simply stood there, accepting the touch of this small human, allowing her to say goodbye in the only way that mattered. Sophie cried. She cried for the fear she had felt, and for the Alpha who had protected her, and for the world that was bigger and stranger and more beautiful than she had ever imagined. The Alpha made a sound, a low humming noise that seemed to come from deep within its crystal body. The other creatures made the same sound, creating a harmony that echoed through the forest. Then Marcus stood up, and he picked Sophie up in his arms, and he began to walk back toward the colony. The creatures did not follow. They stood at the cave entrance, watching the humans leave, watching the young human child disappear into the forest. Behind them, the Krell soldiers were still trapped in the passages. They were cut off, isolated, facing creatures that understood one thing and one thing only: protect the young. And there was no Krell young in those caves. There was only Krell who wanted to hurt. Krell who wanted to kill. The creatures understood the choice they faced. It was clear and simple: survive or protect the young. There was no other option. As Marcus walked through the forest toward the colony, carrying his daughter, he heard the sounds of battle behind him. The creatures had made their choice. They were not leaving the cave entrance. They were not abandoning their post. They were holding the line, buying the humans time, ensuring that Sophie and her father could reach safety. Patricia walked beside Marcus, and she said something that he would remember for the rest of his life. She said that this moment right here was proof of something that humanity had always believed but never proven. She said that the drive to protect the young was stronger than fear, stronger than anger, stronger than the drive to kill. She said that this was what made a species worth living. The colony appeared through the trees, and Marcus started to run. The soldiers behind him ran too. Hannah Martinez was waiting at the colony fence, her hands shaking, her tears streaming down her face. When she saw her daughter, when she saw that Sophie was alive and safe, she screamed her name and ran toward them. The creature that would come to be called the Alpha watched from the cave entrance, watching until the humans disappeared completely. The other creatures gathered around it, and together they retreated deeper into the forest. They had made a choice, and that choice would change their world forever. Behind them, the Krell soldiers were still trying to escape the cave, but they would not make it out. The creatures had made sure of that. And in those dark passages, in those chambers where light never reached, a new understanding was being written in blood and crystal. Protect the young. That was the law of this forest now. 3 weeks after the rescue, the colony held a meeting to discuss what would happen next. Sophie sat in the back of the gathering hall, watching the adults talk about her as if she was not there. Captain Foster was saying that the creatures were dangerous and had to be eliminated. Some of the colonists agreed with him. Others were silent, remembering what Sophie had told them about how the Alpha had protected her, how the creatures had fought against the Krell to save a human child. Dr. Stone listened to all the arguments. He listened to the fear and the anger and the confusion. Then he made a decision that would change the history of 2 species forever. He said that the creatures were not invaders. They were intelligent beings that had made a choice to protect human life. That choice deserved to be respected. He said that Sophie would be the bridge between their 2 species. The colonists did not like it at first. Fear is a strong thing, and the colonists had been afraid for so long. But Sophie was a strong thing too. She stood up in the meeting hall, and she spoke in a voice that was small but clear. She said that the creatures had not hurt her. She said that the Alpha was brave and kind. She said that humans and creatures could live together. She said that protecting the young was what made you a good person. No matter what shape you were, nobody could argue with a 7-year-old girl who had lived through what she had lived through. The colony agreed. They would send an ambassador to the creatures. The ambassador would be Sophie. The first meeting happened at the forest edge, near where Sophie had gathered flowers on that day that seemed like it happened in another lifetime. Marcus and Hannah came with Sophie, and 5 soldiers came to protect them. They waited at the edge of the forest, and they waited, and they waited. The sun was starting to set, and some of the soldiers were getting nervous. Then, the creatures came. There were 5 of them. Led by the Alpha, the creature was moving slowly, and Marcus could see that it was still healing. The wound on its side had scars now, and the crystal skin around it was darker, like it would never be completely clear again. Sophie saw those scars, and she remembered making them better. She had helped fix that wound with her own 2 hands. The Alpha lowered its head, and it stayed lowered. The other creatures did the same. It was a sign of respect, and everyone understood it. The creatures were saying that they meant no harm. Sophie walked forward. Her parents tried to hold her back, but she pulled away. She walked straight to the Alpha, and she looked up at the creature's face. The crystal eyes looked down at her, and there was something in those eyes that looked like love. Not the kind of love that humans understood, but something real and deep and true. Sophie reached out and touched the Alpha's scars. She traced them with her fingers, and the Alpha made that humming sound again, the sound that had terrified the soldiers and comforted the creatures. An agreement was reached that day. The creatures would stay in the forest. The humans would stay in the colony. They would not hunt each other. They would not cross into each other's territory without permission. And if Krell soldiers came back, if any invaders came, they would protect each other. They would protect the young. Weeks became months, and the agreement held. The creatures began to defend the colony from external threats. When Krell raiders came, they were met at the forest edge by creatures with crystal skin and the will to protect those they had chosen as family. The Krell learned quickly that this world was not worth the cost. Sophie went back to school, but she was different now. She had seen things that no child should see. She had faced death and found life in an unexpected place. She had learned that strength did not come from weapons or speed or power. Strength came from the choice to protect someone else, even when it was hard. Even when it was dangerous. Her school friends asked her what the creatures were really like. Sophie told them the truth. She said that the creatures were like humans in all the important ways. They had families. They protected each other. They got hurt and healed. They chose to be brave when braveness was needed. That was all that mattered. Marcus and his team began to study the bioluminescent plants more carefully. They discovered that the plants responded to emotional states. When people felt peaceful, the plants glowed soft and calm. When people felt afraid or angry, the plants glowed bright and harsh. The plants, it seemed, were alive in ways that went deeper than biology. They were connected to the feelings of everything around them. It made sense that Sophie had been able to use them to create peace. She was filled with a need for understanding. She was filled with love for a creature that should have been her enemy. The plants had responded to that truth. Hannah started a school program where colony children learned about the creatures. She taught them to respect the forest. She taught them to understand that intelligence looked different in different species, but it was intelligence all the same. She taught them the first law of this new world: protect the young. 3 months after the rescue, Sophie sat at the edge of the forest with the alpha. The creature was mostly healed now, though the scars would never completely fade. They sat together in silence, the small human girl and the massive alien creature. They did not need to speak. They had already said everything that mattered. In the distance, other creatures played in the forest with human children who had come to learn about them. Soldiers and creatures trained together, understanding that they would be stronger together than apart. The Krell did not come back. Word had spread through the galaxy that this world belonged to creatures that would protect their young to the death. On Earth, a message was sent. Scientists and diplomats and leaders read the story of a small girl and a crystal creature and 2 species that had found a way to live together. Some of them thought it was impossible. Some of them thought it was the beginning of a new kind of human future. But Sophie knew the truth. It was simple. It was not about being human or alien. It was not about weapons or technology or power. It was about understanding what really mattered. It was about seeing another being's heart. No matter how different the being looked, it was about the choice to protect the young. And that choice, once made, could change worlds. Years later, when historians would look back at this moment, they would call it the beginning of the new peace. They would say that humanity's greatest strength was not its science or its weapons. It was not its speed or its intelligence or its ability to build cities and machines. It was the ability to see value in a stranger, to choose compassion over fear, to protect someone else's child as if they were your own. Sophie would grow up and become an ambassador between species. She would teach others what the Alpha had taught her without words, what the forest had taught her through the glowing plants, what her own courage had taught her in the dark cave. That love was stronger than fear, that the drive to protect the young was stronger than the drive to kill. That understanding was possible, even between creatures that had nothing in common except the desire to survive. The Alpha would live a long life, longer than any of its kind had lived before, and it would spend that life protecting the small human who had once sat in its arms, terrified but brave, and had chosen to help it when help was what it needed. In the end, that was what the story was about. Not about 2 species at war, not about weapons or territory or power. It was about a small girl and a big creature and a simple truth that had always been there, waiting to be discovered. In the darkest moment, when everything seemed lost, when fear had won and the future looked like nothing but death and pain, one small act of kindness had changed everything. Sophie had chosen to help the Alpha, and in doing so, she had helped both their species. She had shown that enemies could become family. that enemies could look in each other's eyes and see not a threat, but a being that wanted the same thing they wanted: to protect the young, to survive, to matter. That was all that anyone wanted, no matter where they came from or what they looked like. That was all that any being needed to understand.